The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 1882, and Thea Turner's hands trembled so violently she could barely break the wax seal, knowing that once she stepped off the train in Las Cruces, New Mexico, there would be no turning back from the lie she had been living for the past 3 months. She sat in the cramped women's compartment of the train, watching the landscape transform from the green hills of Missouri to the sparse, golden plains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The other passengers chatted idly about their destinations, their families, their hopes for new beginnings in the Western territories. Thea kept her silence, one hand pressed protectively against her abdomen where a barely perceptible swell hid beneath the layers of her traveling dress. 4 months along, the doctor back in St. Louis had told her. 4 months carrying the child of a man who had promised her the world and delivered nothing but shame and abandonment. Edward Forrester's letters had been kind, almost poetic in their descriptions of his ranch outside Las Cruces, of the wide New Mexico skies, and the honest work that filled his days. He had written that he sought a wife who valued integrity and partnership, someone willing to build a life together in a land that demanded strength and courage. His words had seemed like salvation when Thea had read them in the boarding house where she had been hiding, spending the last of her savings while her belly grew rounder each week. She had answered his advertisement with carefully chosen words, painting herself as a respectable young woman seeking adventure and a fresh start. She had told him about her education, her skill with numbers that had made her valuable as a bookkeeper in her father's store before his death. She had mentioned her mother's passing 2 years prior, leaving her without family ties. All of this was true. What she had not mentioned, what she could not bring herself to write, was the growing evidence of her ruination that would become impossible to hide within another month or 2. The train's whistle screamed as they pulled into Las Cruces station, just as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the Organ Mountains. Thea gathered her 2 small cases and the carpet bag, containing everything she owned in the world, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the dusty window, she could see the platform crowded with people. Miners heading to the silver camps, merchants, families, and ranchers coming to collect supplies. And then she saw him. Edward Forrester stood a head taller than most of the men around him, his dark hair visible beneath a well-worn hat, his shoulders broad in a clean cotton shirt. Even from a distance, she could see the strong line of his jaw and the way he stood with an easy confidence that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. He held his hat in his hands, scanning the disembarking passengers with an expression that was equal parts anticipation and nervousness. Thea forced herself to breathe, to place one foot in front of the other as she descended the train steps. The New Mexico heat hit her immediately, so different from the humid warmth of Missouri. This was a dry heat that seemed to pull the moisture from her skin, and she blinked against the brightness of the sun reflecting off the whitewashed buildings. "Miss Turner." His voice was deep, gentle, with the slight drawl of someone who had spent years under western skies. "Yes." Her own voice came out barely above a whisper. "Mr. Forrester." "Edward, please." He smiled, and the expression transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made her breath catch. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they studied her with an openness that made her feel simultaneously seen and terrified. "Welcome to Las Cruces. I hope the journey was not too difficult." "It was long but not unpleasant," she managed, hyper-aware of the way her corset pressed against her changing body, of the secret that seemed to pulse like a beacon beneath her clothes. He reached for her bags with an easy courtesy. "My wagon is just over here. It is about an hour's ride to the ranch. I thought we might stop at the hotel first, if you would like to freshen up, or perhaps get something to eat. The restaurant serves a decent meal, though I will warn you that nothing in Las Cruces compares to what I imagine you are used to in the city." The consideration in his offer, the way he seemed attuned to what she might need after a long journey, made her throat tighten with emotion. "That would be very kind, thank you." The hotel was a modest two-story building with a wide porch where several men sat smoking and playing cards. Edward led her through the lobby to the small restaurant, where he ordered coffee and sandwiches while she excused herself to the washroom. In the small mirror above the basin, Thea studied her reflection. Her face was pale despite the journey, her dark blonde hair escaping from its pins, her blue eyes shadowed with exhaustion and fear. She splashed water on her face and tried to compose herself, but all she could think was that she was sitting down to share a meal with a good man while carrying another man's child. When she returned to the table, Edward had removed his hat, and she could see him more clearly. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin and the calloused hands of someone who worked his land himself. There was a scar along his jaw, faint but visible, and she found herself wondering about the story behind it. "I want you to know," he said once their food had arrived and they had eaten in companionable silence for a few minutes, "that there is no pressure for anything to happen quickly between us. I have prepared a room for you in the house, and you may take all the time you need to feel comfortable. Marriage is a serious commitment, and while we have exchanged letters, I understand that meeting in person is quite different." Thea's fork clattered against her plate. She had expected a quick ceremony, perhaps even to be married by a traveling preacher before they left town. The advertisements she had read about mail-order arrangements had all suggested immediate marriages, protection of reputation, legal bindings before the journey to isolated ranches. "I do not understand. You wrote that you were seeking a wife." "I am." His gray eyes met hers steadily. "But I believe a marriage should be built on more than letters and hope. I would like us to have time to know each other, to be certain that we can build a life together. My mother always told me that partnership requires honesty and trust, not just legal documents." The word honesty hit her like a physical blow. She set down her fork, her appetite completely gone. "That is very honorable of you. You look troubled," he observed, his brow furrowing with concern. "Have I said something to upset you? If you prefer a quicker ceremony, I certainly will not object." "I only wanted to offer you the choice." "No, it is not that." She struggled to find words that were not a complete lie. "I am simply tired from the journey and everything is so new. You have been very kind, more than I expected." He nodded slowly, though she could see questions in his eyes. "Then let us get you to the ranch. You can rest properly there, and we can talk more when you are feeling settled." The ride to the ranch took them through landscape, unlike anything Thea had ever seen. The desert stretched out in shades of gold and rust, dotted with hardy scrub brush, and the occasional cottonwood tree marking the path of an arroyo. The Organ Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks catching the late afternoon light. Despite her anxiety, she found herself drawn to the stark beauty of the land, the sense of space and possibility that seemed to fill the air itself. Edward's ranch was more substantial than she had imagined. The main house was built of adobe, with a deep porch that wrapped around two sides and windows with real glass rather than shutters. There were several outbuildings, a barn, a stable, what looked like a bunkhouse, and corrals that held horses and cattle. It spoke of years of hard work and careful management. "I run about 200 head of cattle," Edward explained as he helped her down from the wagon. "Plus horses for working the ranch and some I breed for sale. I have 2 men who work for me full-time, Miguel and his son Rafael." They have their own place about a mile south, but they take meals here often. I hope you do not mind cooking for extra mouths sometimes." "I can manage cooking," Thea said, though her mind was spinning with the reality of the life she was stepping into. She had cooked for her father's household, but this would be different, more demanding. Inside, the house was clean and simply furnished, with whitewashed walls and furniture that looked handmade but well crafted. Edward showed her to a bedroom that had clearly been prepared for her arrival. The bed was made with a colorful quilt, and there were fresh flowers in a jar on the small table by the window. "This was my mother's room before she passed 3 years ago," Edward said quietly. "She would have liked knowing someone was using it again. The house has felt too empty since she and my father died." "I am sorry for your loss," Thea said, meaning it. The room still held traces of a woman's presence, a delicacy in the curtains and the careful arrangement of the space. "Thank you." He set her bags down gently. "I will let you rest. The kitchen is through there, and please help yourself to anything you need. I have some work to finish in the barn, but I will be back before dark to make supper. Unless you would rather cook. I do not want to presume." "I can help with supper," she offered, grateful for something to do with her hands, something to focus on besides the growing panic in her chest. He smiled at her, that warm expression that made him look younger. "Then we will cook together. Welcome home, Thea." After he left, she sank onto the bed and let the tears come. Welcome home. The words were so kind, so genuine, and she was repaying his kindness with deception. She placed her hand over her belly, feeling the slight roundness that would soon become impossible to hide. She had perhaps 6 weeks, maybe 2 months if she was lucky with loose clothing, before the truth became visible. But even as the fear threatened to overwhelm her, another part of her mind was already noting the details of the house, the quality of the furnishings, the care that had gone into preparing for her arrival. Edward Forrester was clearly a man of substance and character, exactly the kind of man she should have waited for instead of being seduced by Charles Morrison's smooth words and false promises back in St. Louis. Charles had been the son of her father's business partner, educated and charming, with plans to open his own investment firm. He had courted her properly for 3 months, spoken of marriage, of the life they would build together. And then, when she had finally given in to his persuasions during a late evening in his office, believing they would be married within weeks, everything had changed. The engagement ring he had promised never materialized. His visits became less frequent. And when she had finally summoned the courage to tell him about the baby, he had looked at her with cold eyes and said that she must be mistaken about the father, because he certainly had never made her any promises. She had been alone when her father's longtime physician had confirmed what she already knew. Alone when she had sold her mother's jewelry to pay for a room in a boarding house far from anyone who knew her. And alone when she had seen Edward Forrester's advertisement in the newspaper and recognized it for what it was, possibly her only chance at a life that did not involve complete ruin. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. She wiped her eyes quickly and called out, "Yes." Edward's voice came through the wood. "I do not mean to disturb you, but I realized I forgot to show you where the washroom is and where I keep the towels and such. Would you like me to show you now, or would you prefer to rest?" She opened the door, hoping her face did not show evidence of tears. "Now is fine, thank you." He led her through the house, pointing out the various rooms with an ease that suggested he was comfortable in his own space. The washroom was surprisingly well appointed, with a large tub and a water heater that he explained he had installed himself. "It is one of my few luxuries," he admitted with a slight self-consciousness. After long days working in the sun and dust, A hot bath is about the finest thing I can imagine." "It is wonderful," she said honestly. "There is something else I wanted to mention," he said as they walked back toward the kitchen. "In town, at the hotel, you seemed afraid when I mentioned taking time before marriage. I want to be clear that I meant what I said about no pressure, but I also want you to know that I am sincere in my intentions. If you need the security of marriage sooner rather than later, if there are concerns about your reputation or your situation, I will not delay. I simply wanted to offer you the choice." His perceptiveness made her feel exposed. Did he already suspect? Could he see through her deception so easily? "Why would you think I might have concerns about my situation?" He leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. "Because you traveled alone across half the country to marry a man you had never met. In my experience, people make such journeys for one of two reasons. Either they are running towards something they want desperately, or they are running away from something they cannot face. I am not judging either motivation, Thea. I just want you to know that whatever brought you here, you are safe now." The kindness in his words nearly broke her. She wanted to tell him everything right then, to confess the truth and accept whatever consequences came. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped behind years of being taught that a woman's virtue was her most valuable possession. That shame like hers could never be erased. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." They cooked together that evening, and Thea found herself relaxing slightly as they worked. Edward was easy to talk to, sharing stories about the ranch, about growing up in New Mexico territory, about his parents who had come west from Tennessee after the war. He asked her about her life in Missouri, and she told him the safe stories, about her father's store, about learning to keep books, about her mother's flower garden. "You miss it?" he asked as they sat down to eat the simple meal of beans and cornbread and fried beef. "Parts of it," she admitted, "but it stopped feeling like home after my parents died. Their absence made everything seem hollow." "I understand that," he said quietly. "This ranch was my father's dream, but after he and my mother passed, it felt more like a burden than a gift. I kept it going because it was what they would have wanted, but it was lonely. That is why I finally decided to place the advertisement. A home should have life in it, laughter, partnership. It should not be just a place where a man eats and sleeps between work." "That is a beautiful way to think about it," Thea said, and she meant it. After supper, Edward insisted on washing the dishes while she dried and put them away, learning where things belonged in the kitchen. The domesticity of the moment felt surreal, as though she was playing a part in a story rather than living her actual life. When they finished, Edward bid her good night and headed to his own room on the other side of the house, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her secret. That night, lying in the comfortable bed in what had been his mother's room, Thea stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine how to tell him the truth. Every scenario she constructed in her mind ended with him sending her away, perhaps giving her money for the train ticket back to Missouri out of sheer decency, but certainly not wanting anything more to do with her. She would not blame him. What man would willingly take on another man's child, especially under such circumstances? But as the days passed into weeks, Thea found it harder and harder to imagine leaving. Life at the ranch developed a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. She woke early to make breakfast, and Edward would come in from his morning chores with Miguel and Raphael, who turned out to be warm, friendly men who treated her with courteous respect. She spent her mornings cleaning, mending, and learning to manage a household on a working ranch. The afternoons she often spent with books from Edward's surprisingly extensive library, or walking the land near the house, growing accustomed to the vast openness of the desert landscape. And in the evenings, she and Edward would talk, He was an intelligent man, well-read despite his lack of formal education beyond the basics. He had taught himself about cattle breeding, about the geology of the land, about the delicate balance of water rights and grazing in the harsh climate. He spoke Spanish fluently from growing up in New Mexico, and sometimes she heard him conversing with Miguel in rapid exchanges that she could not follow. More than that, he was kind. Not in a performative way, but with a genuine thoughtfulness that seemed as natural to him as breathing. When he noticed her struggling with the heavy washing, he rigged up a pulley system to make it easier. When she mentioned missing her mother's flower garden, he brought her seeds and helped her prepare a small plot near the house where she could plant them. When she grew tired in the afternoons, something that was happening more frequently as her pregnancy progressed, he never questioned it, simply suggested she rest. 3 weeks after her arrival, they were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sun set over the mountains in a spectacular display of orange and purple, when Edward said, "I want to tell you something." Thea's heart jumped. This was it, the moment when he would confront her about the secret he must have noticed by now. Her dresses were getting tighter despite her efforts to let out seams in the privacy of her room. "Yes, I have been thinking about what I said when you arrived, about taking time before marriage. And I realize now that it might have seemed like I was uncertain about wanting to marry you. That is not the case at all." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious in the fading light. "These past weeks have been some of the happiest of my life. You have brought warmth and life back to this house, and I find myself looking forward to coming inside at the end of the day in a way I have not felt in years. What I am trying to say, rather poorly, is that I would very much like to marry you. But I also want you to feel ready, and I want you to know that you can tell me anything, anything at all. I hope we can build a marriage on honesty, Thea." There it was again, honesty. The word seemed to mock her. "Edward," she began, her voice shaking. This was the moment she had to tell him. "There is something I need to tell you, something I should have told you from the beginning." He waited, his expression patient and open. "I am not." She faltered, the words catching in her throat like thorns. "I am not the woman you think I am." "What do you mean?" She stood abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself, unable to look at him. "I came here under false pretenses. I answered your advertisement not just because I was alone, but because I was desperate. I am not a respectable woman, Edward. I am ruined. And I do not deserve your kindness or your offer of marriage." She heard him stand as well, heard his boots on the wooden porch as he moved closer, though he did not touch her. "Thea, look at me, please." She forced herself to turn to meet his eyes, expecting to see disgust or anger. Instead, she saw only concern. "Whatever you think makes you undeserving is not going to change how I feel about you," he said quietly. "I do not care about your past, about whatever you think you have done. We all have histories, all have made choices we might regret. What matters to me is who you are now, and the woman I have come to know these past weeks is someone I deeply admire and care for." "You do not understand," she said, tears streaming down her face now. "It is not just about past choices. There are consequences. Visible consequences that will become impossible to hide very soon." She watched understanding dawn in his eyes, saw him glance down at where her hands were pressed protectively over her abdomen, then back up to her face. The silence stretched between them, and Thea felt her heart shattering. Finally, he spoke. "How far along?" "Nearly 5 months now," she whispered. "I am sorry. I am so sorry. I should have told you before I came, but I was afraid and alone, and I had nowhere else to go. The father, he wanted nothing to do with me once he found out, said I could not prove it was his. I thought if I could just get here, if I could prove myself useful and good, maybe you would not mind so much. Maybe you would let me stay and work for my keep, even if you did not want to marry me anymore." Edward was quiet for a long moment, and Thea prepared herself for him to tell her to pack her things. Instead, he said something she never expected. "Tell me when you are ready." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "What?" "Tell me the whole story when you are ready," he repeated, his voice gentle. "I can see that this is painful for you, and I do not need to know every detail right now. What I need you to know is that this does not change my desire to marry you, or my belief that we can build a good life together. But I also understand that there is hurt here and shame that you are carrying that you should not have to carry. So tell me when you are ready. Tell me what you want me to know when you feel safe enough to share it." "You cannot mean that," she said, unable to process what he was offering. "Why would you want to marry me now? Why would you take on another man's child?" He moved closer, and this time he did reach out, gently taking her hands in his. "Because I have spent 3 weeks watching you bring life back to this ranch. Because you are kind to Miguel and Raphael, and you have never once treated them as less than equal despite some people in town looking down on Mexican workers. Because you read books about cattle breeding and asked me intelligent questions about the ranch operations. Because you laugh at my terrible jokes and you make the house feel like a home, and because I think if you gave us a chance, we could be happy together." "But the child," she protested weakly. "Will be our child," he said simply. "If you marry me, any child you carry becomes mine in every way that matters. I will not lie and say I am not surprised, or that I do not have questions. But I am also not so foolish as to throw away the chance at happiness because of something that happened before we met." Thea could not stop the sob that escaped her throat. "I do not understand you. Why are you being so kind?" "Because someone should have been kind to you from the start," he said, and there was an edge of anger in his voice, though she knew instinctively it was not directed at her. "Because whatever man fathered that child should have stood by you and instead left you to face shame and difficulty alone. Because you deserve better than what you have been given. And because, Thea, I am falling in love with you, and I do not think that is going to change." She could not speak through her tears. Edward pulled her into his arms, and she collapsed against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, the strength of his embrace around her. He held her while she cried, one hand gently stroking her hair, murmuring soft reassurances that she was safe, that everything would be all right. When she finally pulled back, wiping her eyes with shaking hands, she said, "I do not deserve you." "That is not for you to decide," he said with a slight smile. "Now I think you should rest. This has been an emotional conversation and you need to take care of yourself. But Thea, I meant what I said. When you are ready, tell me everything. Tell me about the father, about what happened, about what you are afraid of. I want to know, not so I can judge you, but so I can help carry some of that burden you have been shouldering alone." That night, Thea slept more deeply than she had since discovering her pregnancy. For the first time in months, the constant anxiety that had been her companion began to ease, replaced by something she had not dared to feel: hope. Over the following week, she and Edward talked more, carefully building the foundation of trust between them. She told him about her father's death, about the debts she discovered afterward that had consumed almost everything. She told him about Charles Morrison, about his courtship and his promises, about the night she had believed they were as good as engaged. She told him about the humiliation of his rejection, the terror of realizing she was pregnant and alone, the desperate decision to answer Edward's advertisement. He listened to all of it without judgment, his expression darkening only when she described Charles's cruelty. "If I ever meet this man," Edward said quietly, "it will take considerable self-control not to show him what I think of men who treat women so dishonorably." "He is not worth your anger," Thea said, though she was touched by the protectiveness in Edward's voice. "Perhaps not, but you are worth defending," he replied. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Las Cruces, with Miguel and Rafael and their families as witnesses. Thea wore a simple blue dress that accommodated her growing belly, and Edward stood beside her in his best suit, holding her hand with gentle firmness as they spoke their vows. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Edward kissed her with a tenderness that made her breath catch, and she felt the last of her fear begin to dissolve. Life, as Edward's wife, settled into a new rhythm. He was unfailingly patient and kind, giving her space to grow comfortable with their new relationship, while also making it clear that he truly meant his vow to accept the child as his own. He came with her to town when she needed to purchase fabric for maternity dresses, standing protectively by her side when she caught the occasional curious or judgmental look from other women. He spoke of the baby as ours with such natural ease that she sometimes forgot the child did not share his blood. As her pregnancy advanced into the 6th and 7th months, Edward became almost comically protective. He insisted she rest more, took over the heavier household chores, and even learned to cook a few meals himself so she would not have to stand for long periods. Miguel's wife, Rosa, began visiting regularly, bringing advice and baby clothes her own children had outgrown, treating Thea as a friend rather than an outsider. One evening in early December, as they sat by the fire and Thea worked on sewing small garments for the baby, Edward said, "I have been thinking about names." Thea looked up, surprised and touched. "Have you? For a boy, I thought perhaps Samuel, after my father. And for a girl, maybe Rose, after my mother." He paused, then added, "But only if you like those names. If you have other preferences, or if you want to choose something that honors your own family, I would understand that too." The casual assumption that he would name the child, that he truly considered himself this baby's father, made her eyes sting with tears. "I think those are beautiful names," she managed. "Your parents would be honored." "They would have loved you," Edward said quietly. "My mother especially. She always wanted daughters, but I was the only child she and my father had. She would have been so excited about this baby." Thea set down her sewing and moved to sit beside him, taking his hand. "I love you," she said, the words coming more easily each time she spoke them. "I do not think I tell you that enough. You have given me everything, a home, safety, a family, and you ask for nothing in return." "That is not true," he said, turning to cup her face in his hand. "You have given me just as much. This house was just wood and adobe before you came. Now it is a home. I was just going through the motions of living. Now I have purpose and joy. We are building this together, Thea. Never doubt that." He kissed her then, and she responded with the passion that had been growing between them since their wedding night. Their physical relationship had been gentle and careful, Edward always mindful of her pregnancy. But there was real love and desire between them, a connection that deepened with each passing day. The baby came on a cold January night in 1883, arriving during a rare desert snowstorm that left the mountains dusted white. Thea's labor was long and difficult, but Rosa was there to help, along with the midwife from town. Edward paced outside the bedroom for hours, and when the baby's first cry finally filled the house, he burst through the door with such a look of desperate hope and fear that Thea laughed through her exhaustion. "A boy," the midwife announced, wrapping the infant in a clean cloth. "A healthy, strong boy." Edward approached the bed slowly, his eyes fixed on the tiny bundle in Thea's arms. She looked up at him, saw the wonder in his face, and held out the baby. "Meet your son, Edward. Meet Samuel Forrester." He took the infant with surprising confidence for a man who had never held a newborn before, cradling Samuel against his chest with infinite care. Tears streamed down his face unashamedly as he studied the tiny features, the miniature hands that gripped his finger with surprising strength. "Hello, Samuel," he whispered. "I am your papa. I am going to love you and protect you for all of my life. You and your mama both." Thea watched him, this man who had taken on a stranger's child without hesitation, and felt her heart so full she thought it might burst. Whatever mistakes she had made, whatever shame she had carried, it had all led her to this moment, to this family, to this love that felt as solid and enduring as the mountains surrounding their ranch. In the months that followed, Edward proved himself as devoted a father as he was a husband. He would rise in the night to bring Samuel to Thea for feeding, then walk the floor with the baby afterward, singing soft Spanish lullabies he had learned from Miguel. He built a cradle with his own hands, carving it from cottonwood and polishing it until it gleamed. He spoke to Samuel constantly as he went about his work on the ranch, narrating everything he was doing as though the infant could understand. "You are going to spoil him terribly," Thea said one afternoon, watching Edward play with the 6-month-old baby, making ridiculous faces that sent Samuel into peals of laughter. "That is my right as his father," Edward replied without a trace of irony. "Besides, look at that smile. How could I not do everything in my power to make him happy?" As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, it became increasingly obvious that he did not resemble Edward in the slightest. His hair was lighter, his eyes a different shape, his features clearly taking after Thea and presumably Charles Morrison. But Edward never seemed to notice or care. To him, Samuel was simply his son, and that was the end of it. The ranch prospered during those years. Edward's careful management and Thea's bookkeeping skills proved to be an excellent combination, and they were able to expand their herd and improve their infrastructure. They built a second bedroom onto the house, and when Thea discovered she was pregnant again in the fall of 1884, Edward was overjoyed. "Samuel needs a brother or sister," he declared, spinning her around the kitchen in an impromptu dance that made her laugh and tell him to be careful. Their daughter, Rose, was born in the spring of 1885, and if Edward had been devoted to Samuel, he was absolutely besotted with his daughter. She had her father's gray eyes and dark hair, and from the moment she entered the world, she had him wrapped around her tiny finger. "You were right," Thea told him one evening as they watched their 2 children playing together, 3-year-old Samuel carefully showing his baby sister a smooth stone he had found. "I was worried about nothing. You love them both exactly the same. How could I not?" Edward said, pulling her close. "They are ours, Thea, both of them. It does not matter who contributed what blood. What matters is the family we are building together." As the years passed, Samuel and Rose were joined by 2 more children. A son they named Thomas in 1887, and another daughter, Elizabeth, in 1889. The house that had once seemed too large for one lonely man now rang with the sounds of children's laughter, of family dinners, of life in all its chaotic beauty. Samuel grew into a tall, thoughtful boy who loved working alongside his father on the ranch. He never questioned Edward's place as his father, never seemed to realize that the man who taught him to rope cattle and break horses was not his biological parent. It was not until he was 12 that the subject came up at all. They were working together to repair a section of fence when Samuel said, "Papa, Jimmy Rodriguez at school said something strange to me yesterday." Edward looked up from the post he was setting. "What was that?" he said. "I do not look anything like you." "He said I must take after Mama's family entirely." Samuel paused, then added with the directness of youth, "But I do not look exactly like Mama either. My hair is lighter than hers and my eyes are different." Edward set down his tools and gave Samuel his full attention. "What did you say to Jimmy?" "I told him that families are about more than just looks, that lots of kids do not look exactly like their parents." Samuel hesitated, but it made me wonder, is there something I should know? Edward was quiet for a moment, and Thea, who had heard the conversation from where she was bringing them water, froze. They had discussed this moment, had known it would come eventually, but had never quite decided how to handle it. Finally, Edward said, "Your mother and I have always believed in honesty, Samuel, so I am going to tell you the truth, and I want you to listen carefully." Samuel nodded, his young face serious. "When your mother came to New Mexico to marry me, she was already carrying you. Your biological father was a man back in Missouri who did not treat your mother well and who walked away from his responsibilities. But from the moment I learned about you, even before you were born, I chose to be your father in every way that matters. I was there the night you were born. I was the first person to hold you after your mother. I have been there for every moment of your life since then, and I will continue to be there for every moment to come. You are my son, Samuel, not because of blood, but because of love and choice and commitment. Do you understand?" Samuel looked between Edward and Thea, processing this information. Then, to their surprise, he smiled. "So what you are saying is that you chose to be my papa. You did not have to be, but you wanted to be." "Exactly," Edward said, relief evident in his voice. "That is even better," Samuel declared, "because it means you loved me before you even met me. That is pretty special, Papa." Edward pulled his son into a fierce embrace, and Thea wiped away tears as she watched them. This boy, who had been the source of so much fear and shame, was now surrounded by so much love that the circumstances of his conception seemed utterly irrelevant. That evening, after the children were in bed, Edward and Thea sat on the porch as they had so many times over the years. The desert night was cool and clear, the stars brilliant overhead. "You handled that perfectly," Thea said, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "He is a remarkable boy," Edward replied. "They all are. We are very lucky, Thea." "I still cannot believe sometimes that this is my life," she admitted. "When I stepped off that train 9 years ago, I was so frightened. I thought my life was over, that I would never have anything but shame and struggle, and now I have everything I could have ever dreamed of." "We have everything," Edward corrected gently. "You gave me as much as I gave you, perhaps more. This family, this life we have built, it is ours together." She turned to kiss him, this man who had seen her at her most desperate and had offered her not just charity but love. "Do you remember what you said to me that night on the porch when I finally told you about the baby?" "I remember every word of that conversation," he said. "You told me to tell you when I was ready. You gave me time and space and patience when I had no right to expect any of those things." She took his hand, pressing it to her heart. "I want you to know that I am ready now, ready to leave behind any lingering shame or fear, ready to embrace this life completely without reservation. You have given me the greatest gift anyone could give, the gift of being loved exactly as I am." "And you," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion, "have given me the gift of family, of purpose, of knowing what it means to love someone so completely that their happiness becomes as important as your own breath. I meant what I said when I married you, Thea. You and the children are my life now, my whole heart." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, the desert night alive with its own subtle sounds. Inside the house, their 4 children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and wanted. The ranch spread out around them, the land they had worked together to build into something prosperous and enduring. Thea thought back to that desperate young woman on the train, hiding her shame beneath layers of fabric, convinced that her life had been ruined by one mistake. She wished she could tell that frightened girl what awaited her. A love deeper than she had imagined possible, children who filled her days with joy, a partnership built on honesty and trust and mutual respect. As if reading her thoughts, Edward said, "Do you ever regret answering my advertisement?" "Not for a single moment," she replied without hesitation. "Though I wish I had been braver in the beginning. I wish I had told you the truth from the start." "You told me when you were ready," he said, echoing his own words from years before. "That is all that ever mattered." The timing was exactly as it should have been. The years continued to pass in a blur of hard work and deep satisfaction. Samuel grew into a young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, taking on more and more responsibility. Rose proved to have a head for numbers even sharper than her mother's, and she would sit at the kitchen table helping Thea with the account books, asking questions that showed a keen business mind. Thomas was the adventurous one, always exploring further into the desert, bringing back interesting rocks and stories of his discoveries. Elizabeth, the youngest, had inherited her father's gentle nature and could calm the most skittish horse with nothing but patience and soft words. When Samuel was 18, he asked Edward's permission to court Maria Rodriguez, Jimmy's older sister. Edward gave his blessing gladly, and 2 years later, they celebrated Samuel's wedding with a huge gathering at the ranch. Watching Samuel stand beside his bride, so clearly in love and beginning his own journey toward building a family, Thea felt the circle complete. "He is happy," Edward murmured in her ear as they watched Samuel and Maria dance. "Because you showed him what a good man looks like," Thea replied. "Because you gave him an example of how to love well and honorably." Edward turned to her, still handsome despite the silver threading his hair now, his face lined with years of working under the sun. "We did that together. Never forget that. We built this family together, every step of the way." As the celebration continued around them, their other children dancing and laughing, their ranch hands and neighbors enjoying the feast they had prepared, Thea looked at the life they had created and felt nothing but profound gratitude. The secret she had once been terrified to tell had become just another thread in the tapestry of their shared history, neither more nor less important than any of the other experiences that had shaped them. Years later, when she and Edward sat on the porch as grandparents, watching their grandchildren play in the yard, she would sometimes think back to that first conversation, to the moment when Edward had said those 6 simple words, "Tell me when you are ready." Those words had given her the space to heal, the freedom to share her burden in her own time, and the foundation for a trust that had only deepened over the decades. They had been a gift more precious than she had realized in that moment, offering her agency and compassion when she had expected judgment and rejection. "What are you thinking about?" Edward asked, his hand finding hers with the ease of long habit. "Just remembering," she said, squeezing his fingers. "Remembering how lucky I was that day I stepped off the train and found you waiting." "I am the lucky one," he insisted, as he had countless times over the years. "You brought life to this place, Thea. You made a house into a home, a lonely man into a husband and father. You gave me everything worth having." Their eldest grandson, Samuel's boy, came running up to the porch. "Grandpa, will you tell us a story? Mama says you tell the best stories about the old days." Edward laughed and ruffled the boy's hair. "What kind of story would you like to hear?" "Tell us about when you met Grandma," another grandchild called out. "Tell us about how you fell in love." Edward looked at Thea, his gray eyes still holding the same warmth and devotion they had shown that first day at the train station. "Well," he began, "it started with a letter and a train ride. Your grandmother was the bravest woman I had ever met, though she did not know it yet. She traveled all the way from Missouri to New Mexico, not knowing what awaited her, trusting that maybe, just maybe, she would find a new beginning. And did she? The children chorused, though they had heard this story many times. She did, Edward said, pulling Thea close. We both did. Sometimes the best things in life come from taking chances, from being honest even when it is frightening, and from believing that love can build bridges over any difficulty. Thea rested her head on his shoulder, listening to him tell their story to the eager children, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun and the even warmer presence of the family surrounding them. The secret that had once terrified her had long since transformed into just one part of a much larger story, a story of redemption and grace, of second chances and steadfast love. As the sun began its descent toward the Oregon mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thea reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From shame and fear to security and joy, from desperate deception to profound honesty, from believing herself ruined to knowing herself cherished. "I love you," she whispered to Edward, soft enough that only he could hear. "I love you too," he replied, his voice holding all the tenderness of 30 years together. "Every day, every moment, you and our family are my greatest blessing." And as their grandchildren played and their own children gathered close, as the ranch that they had built together spread out around them in testament to decades of hard work and partnership, Thea knew that her story had found its truest ending not in the dramatic revelation of her secret, but in the quiet, steadfast love that had grown between them through years of shared life. The mail-order bride who had been terrified to tell her secret had found a cowboy who said to tell him when ready. And in that simple offer of patience and grace, she had found not just a husband but a true partner, not just a home but a haven, not just survival, but a love that had endured and deepened through every season, every challenge, every joy.